the 1970s. No, not the band that's in 1975. I'm talking about the decade, the 70s. You probably couldn't tell it from looking at me, but oh my god, do I love the 1970s. Now when I say this, I don't mean the ideals of the 1970s, because if I was alive back then, I probably would be lobotomized by now. What I mean is the aesthetic of the 70s. When I dress up like it's the 70s, or I look at pictures, or I just see things that generally remind me of that era, I feel a sense of nostalgia. But here's the thing. You can probably also tell this from looking at me. I was not born back then. I never experienced that era in time. I was born in 2004. So when I look back and I see this sense of nostalgia, it's nostalgia for a time I was never alive in. Anemoia was a term coined by John Koenig in the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows about a decade ago. What is anemoia? Anemoia is nostalgia for a time you've never known. If you guys can hear any noise in the background of this clip, it's my rat eating a Cheerio. Moving on. If you've ever found yourself wondering what it would be like to be a lighthouse keeper in the 1800s, how much you would have thrived at that, or maybe you wish you were a wheat farmer in medieval England, I'm not going to judge you, I just don't know why you would choose that. You're not alone. If you just find yourself in general thinking about how you would have done so much better in the past, you may be experiencing anemoia. What a lot of people don't realize is anemoia is a way of looking at the past that is very oversimplified, and often through rose-tinted glasses. And what I mean by that is, anemoia views the past as this almost surreal, dreamlike escape from reality. It's idealistic. You can look at any period in time, really, and think, wow, the 50s must have been so much fun, because when you hear about the 50s, what you mainly hear about is people's stories of the 50s, what a lot of older generations refer to as the good old days. When people are talking about the good old days, the things they don't really mention are the things that you don't want to remember about the past, the things that were negative to society. They don't talk about the Jim Crow laws, or the rampant sexism, or the ostracization of queer people. They tell you about how they used to sit on their front porch and wait for the milkman, or how everything was just safer back then. They tell you about the good times. And that's not no fault of them. When you think about your past, you don't want to remember the bad things that happened, you want to remember the good things that happened. Which brings me to my next point. Why is anemoia so commonly found in Gen Z? Well, let's do a case study. I was born in 2004, like I said many a times in this video. That means I grew up, again, post 9/11, before COVID. Everything was just in this weird liminal space. Think about it. Anywhere from 2004 to 2019, everything just felt kind of off, weird. But that's the only time I've ever known. So to think about these stories that I've heard from other people, these pictures and videos and media I've consumed from the past, I see it in this rose-tinted way. And I see it in this way that makes me want to regress to a time when things were simpler. I want to regress to the good old days. Obviously, I'm looking at the past through those rose-tinted glasses that anemoia so commonly puts on somebody when they think about that kind of thing. But what I think a lot of people my age tend to romanticize these times is because the past few years have obviously been crazy. And while I think it's affected everybody in a lot of different ways, I think most of all it's affected people who are still in school. I graduated in 2022, which means that the last 2 years of my high school experience were very antisocial. Again, obviously not by choice, but by need. With those past couple of years still highly present in a lot of young people's minds, because let's face it, that was a huge portion of their life up until this point, there is a large desire to return to that childlike innocence. So with that desire in mind, it makes sense for these people to wish to return to a time where life was normal, where they aren't dealing with the mental effects caused by years of isolation. They naturally return to their childhood. And the 2000s and the 90s are making huge resurgences in fashion, in music, in aesthetics in general. Take that one step further, and they're referring to what older generations called the good old days. When all you hear of something is stories, it starts to become this almost fictional place in your mind. Like, just think of it for me. If you weren't alive, let's say in the 80s, you think about the 80s, maybe you think of media like Stranger Things, or maybe you think of movies from that time, Adventures in Babysitting, The Goonies. You look at it and you see these real, true stories with these very, very potent energies to them. And you think, wow, man, that's just so cool. That's something I would have liked to be a part of. That's when time periods start to become fictional places for your mind to wander during dull periods of existence. I think for some people, me especially, Anemoia, while it is a wonderful way to escape reality for a little bit and to think about, the fictional place that was 1964, it's also a way to connect to people whose lives may have been forgotten. In middle school, I didn't have a lot of friends. A lot of my time was spent by myself. So what I did is I turned to people who I never knew. When I was probably in about 7th grade, I started collecting antique photos ranging anywhere from the mid-1800s to about 1960s. When I saw these photos, not only did I see these wonderful depictions of these times I never knew, I saw these people I never knew. People whose whole lives had been lived out in full, who had already been born and died and lived everything in between before the time I was even thought about. And in that way, when I'd look at these pictures, I would kind of recognize their presence. I would recognize their place in society at the time. For me, it was a type of escapism that was based semi in reality. I could watch all of the BBC Sherlock I wanted, or the Supernatural, and that was fun and games. But when I looked at these pictures and I saw these people, I felt connected to them. There's a good chance that a lot of these pictures that I had, nobody had looked at in decades. There's a good chance that some of these pictures I had, nobody knew these people had ever existed outside of their loved ones, or maybe their family members that had these pictures at one point. When I looked at these pictures, I felt like I was there with them, experiencing that time and place. However, sometimes when you look at the past, say you see a picture from 1950 of two little kids running around their backyard, the sprinkler's on, the sun is out, there's a dog nipping at their feet. It can be a perfectly happy picture, a depiction of pure Americana. It can make you feel sad. What is that? What I think it is that Anemoia, while it can be a very, very comforting feeling, can also be really sad. It can make you feel lonely. It can make you feel like you missed out on that time. You see this, and you see these depictions of people being happy and living their lives, and you realize you'll never get to live like that. You'll never get to experience exactly what those people experienced. So in that way, you're missing out. When I was in middle school and I was obsessed with the 40s, I would spend hours and hours looking at those photos. My grandfather bought me a typewriter because I wanted to experience the technology of the past. I would flip through Life magazines from the late 30s and the early 40s, and I would just examine them. I would look at them for hours. Albeit I had no friends, obviously, because I was spending so much time looking at old Life magazines. But it brought me a sense of comfort, and at the same time, it made me realize how alone I was. I think with our generation, Gen Z, I think with Anemoia comes the longing for a time with a sense of community. Again, with the past few years, there has been the further distancing of people. You see people acting out in ways they haven't in the past. You see this huge, huge change in the demeanor of society. And again, that can be chalked up to all of COVID and the pandemic and everything that happened in the past few years. What it comes down to is we are in the age of technology. We are in the rise of the internet. And with that comes the further distancing of people. People can communicate on their phones. I've had friends online that I have never met in person. So when you look at these pictures and you see these videos and you see these shows, you see the sense of community that isn't super prevalent anymore today. A lot of people are lacking that sense of community that seems to be so emphasized in the late 1800s to the basically all of the 20th century. Looking back on it, if I had to choose a time period that I feel deeply connected to and that I think I would have done very well in, I don't think it would have been the 1940s. I can picture myself living in New York in the 1960s, You know, cigarette hanging from my nicotine-stained fingers, pair of big sunglasses on. Maybe I'm a writer, maybe I'm an artist, maybe I work at a bar. But I think of the aesthetic of the 60s, and I think about how I think I could have lived there. I think I would have been okay there. And maybe you've listened to all of this. Maybe you've heard me spout on and on about the past and thought, I don't think that would be for me. Maybe I've thought about it, but I think I'm okay with living right now. If that was you during this video, all I have to say is, good on you, man. I think you were born in the right time period. But that's not the same for everybody. And if you were one of the people who were thinking, man, I would love to be a cowboy in the golden age of the Wild West, or, you know, it would have been really fun to experience the 1990s when I was in my early 20s. Just think about why. And then maybe think about how you can bring those experiences to the modern age. Obviously, like I said, I would like to live in the 60s. Not really, but the idea is fun. So how do I bring that to this age? I wear clothes that are inspired by the late 60s, early 70s. I collect knickknacks that are older than I am, older than my parents are. And I just try to appreciate the past without becoming too invested in the idea of being there. Anemoia can be a very, very upsetting feeling. It can leave people feeling alone or like they missed out on a big portion of history. But Anemoia can also be a wonderful way to connect to times that you'll never know. It can be a wonderful way to meet people who are also interested in that. If you're feeling like you lack that sense of community, maybe use the godforsaken internet to your advantage and go on there and find people who also like 80s board top games or the way that Victorians made hog hair brushes. Find people who are interested in that. And then maybe, through Anemoia, you won't feel so lonely anymore.